Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. My name is Dave Edelman and this webinar is brought to you by TrainingPros in cooperation with Harrisburg University. I'll tell you a little bit about TrainingPros, a little bit about myself, a little bit about our partnership with Harrisburg University, and then we'll get started. And hopefully that'll give time for folks to join us and make sure we have everybody on the line. TrainingPros is a company that helps our clients find contract talent in the learning and development arena. So we have a group of relationship managers that work directly with our clients when they need contract help, either if they don't have that capacity, that capability within their team, or they just need extra help for big projects that are coming on and so forth. Folks like myself that are relationship managers that work with our clients have been in the industry for a long time, and we kind of understand about training. So when we talk to our clients and their projects, we know what they're talking about, and we're better able to help them. We have a pool of consultants, over 9,000 in our talent pool right now. So we have consultants for almost any project that has anything to do with learning and development. And we have an onboarding for success methodology to make sure that our consultants get up and running correctly. We don't just say, okay, here you go. We kind of make sure that there are expectations set forth with our consultants and our clients. And this makes things a lot smoother, and we found that this really works for us. We place folks in a variety of L&D roles. Here's just some of them: instructional design, organization development, facilitation, change management, e-learning, technical writing, project manager. The list goes on, LMS coordinators, web designers, and things like that, but all, again, involved with the training and development or talent development field. A little bit about myself. I've been a relationship manager for over 3 years now at TrainingPros. I am in the Southeast, work in the Atlanta market, primarily Florida and Atlanta. I have worked in hospitality, healthcare, and insurance industries. I have been in the L&D profession for, I don't know, 30 years or so, I guess, a long time. And I'm an active member with the Atlanta chapter of ATD. And if you're in Atlanta and in L&D and you're not a member of the Atlanta chapter, you're definitely missing out on something. I was the VP of Community Relations for the last 2 years, and as the time was up for that role, stepped down, and now I'm working directly with United Way on our partnership with them, helping them facilitate classes and doing some volunteer work and things like that, and organizing that with our chapter. I'm also a training consultant, instructional designer, and I have my own company, Edelman Training Solutions. And most of my work I do through TrainingPros. So if you need to contact me, I'm at david.edelman@training-pros.com. And just a little bit about our partnership with Harrisburg University. We partner on these Learning Views webinars because we want to share the latest developments that TrainingPros is observing with our clients, and also help Harrisburg University demonstrate how they're able to provide master levels programs to professionals who want to or need to pursue advanced degrees in the learning technology space. We're really happy to be presenting this webinar. I see people are still coming in. We hope that at the end of this session, you'll be able to walk away from the session a little better informed to explore stories for learning within the context of alternate reality games, and maybe even start implementing some of these strategies. I'm really excited to turn the show over now to Charles Palmer, Associate Professor of Interactive Media, and Andy Petroski, Andy Petroski, new Product Development Consultant for Harrisburg University. Welcome, guys. Take it away.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. This is Andy, and welcome to Robots Are Eating the Building Narrative for Increased Engagement. As Dave mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at storytelling as a tool for training, learning and development, and e-learning techniques, as well as looking at training stories through the lens of alternate reality games. And so just a little bit about me to start off, and then I'll hand it over to Charles to really kind of get into the session. So as of more recently, I'm a senior new product development consultant with Harrisburg University, but I've been on the faculty and in the learning technology space at the university for about 8 years now. 19 years ago today, I was reading, well, maybe not exactly April 21st, but around this time of year, I was reading an article in Education Weekly about students learning through the use of computers and how stories, entertainment, and games and educational technology was having an impact on student satisfaction and their learning outcomes as a result. After reading that article, I was hooked. I quit my job and went to grad school full-time. Fast forward 19 years now, and I'm creating e-learning for students and employees with a focus on highly engaging experiences. And I'm excited to be in this webinar with all of you talking about how stories can impact learning outcomes and how story is a key element of alternate reality games. So I'm really looking forward to today and going to turn it over to Charles for an intro into today's session.
Hello, everyone. As Andy mentioned, my name is Charles Palmer. I'm our Director for Center of Advanced Entertainment and Learning Technologies, but I'm also a professor of interactive media here at HU. I've been here about 8 years. My background is mostly on the entertainment side, which has been a wonderful sort of complement to Andy's skill sets on the learning side as we've looked at developing interactive and e-learning projects. Both of us can be reached. We're all over LinkedIn and SlideShare, which are listed there, as well as our Twitter feed, and we would love to connect with you after the event to learn a little bit more about what you're doing in the space and what your interests are. Sort of a little bit of shameless self-promotion. Andy and I have just released our first book. It's been out almost 10 days now, and most of the content coming from today's webinar is actually included in the pages of the book here. So if you're looking for some additional information or you're looking to learn more or go a little further, it might be helpful to you to pick up the book. We also have a website that associates with, which is associated with the book. That's almost live. It'll be completely operational very shortly, but if you want to visit the site now, you can sign up for notifications. You can see there the link for Twitter as well as the Facebook page, which supports it, and the Amazon link there as well for you to go out and find your copy and get started learning a lot more about alternate reality games and how they are used along with gamification for improving employee performance. As you signed up and registered for this event today, you listed some of the types of answers that you were hoping to get out of this particular session. So when we collected those and sort of looked at what we wanted to talk about and where our focus was going to be today, we saw that there was an interest in a wide range of things, starting off with very general interests, but also diving into sort of some of the current storytelling techniques. So listed here are the things that we're going to talk about throughout today's webinar. Improved ID techniques, expanding storytelling techniques, increased learner engagement, interesting topics, as well as learning about ARGs. And in some way, we will touch upon each one of these different elements as we go. But we have the comment space that Andy and I and Justin will manage, so feel free to use the chat space to type questions or even answer each other's questions. It's great to see a lively conversation taking place in the chat, where it's not just Andy and I presenting information, but it's you all sharing with this as well. So, where are we going today? These are the topics of today's session. We're really going to talk a lot about the power of story and narrative. We want to look at the various learner types and maybe story methods that might be associated with those player types or learner types. We will dissect stories as we discuss plot, setting, and subject. We'll look at various perspectives and the structure themselves of stories. And as I mentioned, feel free to use the chat space to keep the conversation going throughout the talk. With that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Andy, and I'll be back in a little bit.
In Robots Are Eating the Building, a cohort of small, devious robots are destroying the main academic tower of Harrisburg University. No one knows their ultimate goal, but the destruction at the start of the Learning and Entertainment Evolution Forum was certainly not part of the planning committee's schedule. It was quickly determined that these sentient beings can be defeated by acquiring and uploading specific bits of data to the building's network, effectively overloading the robot's memory as they try to make sense of the data. The story of the robots was used to kick off the game during the opening session of the conference, the video that you just saw. With all of the conference attendees in the auditorium, the host directed everyone to a pretend live feed, which was the video you just saw, from the security desk. At the time, the security area was being introduced in the live session as a hub for information and directions if attendees needed assistance during the conference. The video showed a standard, as you saw, CCTV security of video with 4 separate feeds, and then those, as the security desk was being highlighted and emphasized at the beginning of the video, the feeds went fuzzy and you saw the robots appear. So this is an example of a story, or the beginning of a story in alternate reality games, and potentially the impact that stories can have. So let's start thinking about that a little bit. And in the text chat, just a short thought on what the impact of this video, or what impact this video had on you, and maybe what impact you think it might have had on the audience at the conference, where there might have been a lot more context for the video. So Gene, you'd say it got your attention? Yep, okay, I see that right under your note about being spooked. Okay, so Laura, potentially kind of took you into another space or another reality, for some moment. Okay, so while you continue to type some thoughts in there, let's begin thinking a little bit more about how stories impact us. And you can keep chatting at this time. So right now I'd like you to think a little bit about, as we begin to think about impact, but also format and structure, type in the chat a little bit about what your favorite story is and why it's your favorite story. So Tim, back to the robots, there was a little bit of prediction there, and we'll talk in a little bit about prediction and stories and how that impacts learning. So let's see. Anyone have a favorite story? Okay. One of the favorite stories that I always think about is a movie, just because my wife and I watch it quite often, or at least once a year. Is the mockumentary Best in Show, and I just love the characters and how they can relate to different people that you've met, especially if you're a pet owner, and or even different parts of your own pet owner personality. Okay, we've got some Twilight Zone and others. Okay, so imagine, if you will, your story presented like this, like the manner on the screen. This is an example of what we as instructional designers and trainers often do with content that could have a really good story. So I'm going to get your input here as well. So what's missing from this story? And I'll kind of move this to the side so you can still see the bullet points. Sorry about that. Okay, so there are a lot of different elements of training and or instructional techniques that are missing from this story that we included in a little bit of the conversation about the robots are eating the building video. All of these elements impact experience, engagement, and memory, and can all be a part of learning experiences with stories if we apply storytelling well in training and instructional designs. So thanks for participating in that. As we've established, stories can play a role in effective learning and in triggering and actually triggering chemical reactions that can aid learning. Situations that are new or potentially challenging trigger the release of acetylcholine, and in turn, our attention is much more attuned to the situation at hand. So when we talk about stories grabbing our attention, there's actually a physical reaction that's happening that aids learning when that happens. Stories that present a problem immediately do a much better job at getting our attention. When we're presented with something that's novel, like humor, or a twist in a story, or some type of unexpected connection, a release of norepinephrine is triggered. Norepinephrine works with dopamine to create a chemical rush that helps us go from novel interest to an intense desire, creating a rich learning environment where we are alert, pay attention, and find excitement without threat. A way of triggering the release of dopamine through story is with that power of prediction, and I mentioned that before. What do you think will happen next? Just that one question or that one kind of hanging sense of excitement, even the chance to get a prediction right increases the release of dopamine. So in addition to just good strategy and good technique in learning design and instructional design, stories can have an impact on the chemical or physical reactions in our body as well. And these chemicals all have an impact on our memory, and these release of chemicals, as I mentioned, can be released or triggered by stories. Another thing to think about when we're looking at stories is the fact that neuroscience has proven that everything the brain learns is filtered through emotions. There are no exceptions. How we use emotion to aid learning determines learning success, and stories can be emotional experiences and ways to impact that emotion or to input emotion into learning solutions. And if we go back to that screen of Cinderella, that was one of the, we didn't necessarily identify it specifically in the poll, but certainly could have been another thing that was missing was any sense of emotion at all. And, the story itself has a lot of emotion to it, but in the bullet point form, all of that is missing. So now let's take a look at traditional learning experiences and maybe how those can be impacted by stories. So here's a visual representation of the type of experience that often occurs from traditional instructional design methods. This page turner experience is where learners just click through information screen after information screen until they get to a quiz to test their memory on previous content, or maybe there's a drag and drop activity that breaks up the information presentation, and that's good, but those activities are often content specific or more about user interaction with the screen than they are often about mentally engaging the learner. So let's take a look at a couple of ways to impact that. And for those of you that are typing in the chat, I'll definitely take a look at those when I'm not presenting and hand it over to Charles and get back to you on those questions. And so I appreciate your patience, but certainly continue to type in there any questions or comments that you do have. There are a variety of methods for incorporating stories into learning, but for the purposes of today's webinar, we'll just consider two methods. The content-driven method integrates a story element into traditional content presentation. This may take the form of a character whose situations are highlighted along with the content presentation and in assessments. So let's look at an example of that. Maria is preparing her expense report today. After stepping in a mud puddle on the way into the building, banging her knee on the corner of her desk, and spilling her coffee all over her receipts. She's ready to start entering expenses. Here are the 4 steps Maria must remember to enter her expenses correctly, and envision those steps on the screen. This is a hypothetical situation. Or this could be in the form of an assessment. The story might end with a question. What are the 4 steps Maria must remember to enter her expenses correctly? So give me a moment here, and I'm going to go back to our, actually I'm going to drag this out onto the screen, and I am going to clear these results and ask you guys to give me your input again about what's missing with this story, and certainly encourage you to indicate anything additional to the pre-entered answers, and type in the text chat some of your additional thoughts there. So while you're taking the poll, Chuck has a question that was short and easy for me to kind of pull out there, and about the benefits of props. So Chuck, I'm assuming you're talking about in a live situation, and I think there are certainly opportunities there, and one of the things to consider with stories and with props and really all of these types of techniques is that they have positive impacts versus neutral or negative impacts. So you always kind of straddle a line of making sure that your humor is on target, that things aren't too kitschy or make folks uncomfortable, or too trendy, or only really meeting the needs or hitting the target with with one member of the audience. And as we look at some of these story examples, these are certainly going to be out of context today, and just pieces of snippets of things to look at and consider. So the story as it's written is really an example of just a story around content. So we're not really interacting with Maria. We're not really taking any type of scenario-based approach. We're not really reflecting ourselves on the story as much as we are focused on the content, and the content is really just kind of packaged in a story format, and that's one way of doing it. So there are still some detriments to this approach, as you've noticed, with a lack of, or didn't really get your attention. It's not too motivating. It's not relatable necessarily, and certainly there's not a ton of emotion there. So let's take a look at another strategy. But this is certainly a strategy, and it's one way to integrate stories. It's beyond just directly presenting the information as completely just facts and figures, and begins to get into some of the benefits of storytelling. Whereas the story-driven method depends on the story and the characters to drive the experience, and for the learner to interact with the story by applying knowledge and skills, testing hypotheses, and evaluating situations. So I'll read another version of this story, and I don't have this one on screen for you, but here we go. So Maria is a supervisor in the public relations department. She's been with the company in her role for 5 years. She's interested in a promotion, but she's been looked over for leadership roles in recent months and been told it's because of her lack of organization and reluctance to follow process. She's a very creative and dynamic leader, but struggles with crossing her T's and dotting her I's. One task that Maria is always behind on is submitting her monthly expenses. She struggles with organizing her receipts, but also struggles with the system. Maria is preparing her expense report today. After stepping in a mud puddle on the way into the building, banging her knee on the corner of the desk, and spilling her coffee all over her receipts, she's ready to start entering expenses. She struggles from the get-go when she realizes she can't remember where to access the expense program on the internet. Can you help Maria access the expense program? There are 4 resources at your disposal with varying levels of detail. You only need one of them to find the information you need, but hurry, Maria needs to get her expense report completed today. So hopefully you can see, again, in a kind of out of context, just snippet example, the difference between those two methods and how getting into deeper storytelling can have an impact on some of those elements that we were identifying that were missing in the other examples. And certainly love to hear your comments and questions in the text chat as I continue, and I'll get to those again as we have time and as Charles, as I hand things off to Charles later. In addition to the two primary methods, there are several story techniques to consider. The previous example used a narrative technique that told a story and asked the learner to interact with the story. A conversation technique might ask the learner to select a response while playing or advising one side of the conversation, where an observation technique might ask the learner to reflect on what played out as they observe the story or the conversation. So it can be from a variety of different perspectives. Other techniques that can be integrated into a narrative, conversation, or observation are humor, exaggeration, and scenes that incorporate a wide variety of activities. So now let's come back to alternate reality games a little bit. In a previous webinar, we introduced ARGs. We're not doing that here today, but to bring everyone up to speed on ARGs, I'll just do a short summary. Alternate reality games are not computer or video games, though electronic devices including computers, cell phones, and GPS-enabled handhelds are used to access clues and other game elements. The game can really be anywhere: websites, stores, signs, recorded telephone messages, or printed materials. ARGs are not role-playing games. The players normally function as themselves in the real-world environment. And stories in ARGs are a really big component of the alternate reality game experience. The story for an ARG should provide direction and context for gameplay. It should address both personal and group goals. The ultimate player reward may be winning the game, winning a prize, or receiving some other sort of recognition. But the story goal should be about saving the day, discovering a new opportunity, or overcoming adversity, both at an individual and group level. The story ties together the gameplay elements and the interactions between players and non-player characters. Story and narrative at ARGs is referred to in various ways throughout the book that Charles and I wrote on alternate reality games, and again, we're taking some of that content into today's session, but just a quick connection back to alternate reality games and the impact that stories have in ARGs. Whether you're creating a story for an alternate reality game or an online training course, you should consider the story perspective that makes the most sense for your audience and the learning goals. In the Maria story we've been using as an example, the story is realistic and connected. Maria's is a common scenario you'd find in any office setting, and a public relations manager role is a common one. So it's very realistic and connected to the real life role. In addition to realistic connected, there are realistic disconnected, fictional connected, and fictional disconnected perspectives to consider. In a realistic disconnected perspective, Maria might be, and let me just grab this here. So you choose one from column A and column B. So now we're in realistic disconnected. In that perspective, Maria might be a public relations supervisor on Mars. So her role is realistic, but her environment is disconnected from the real world environment that the training is going to be applied in. In a fictional connected perspective, so fictional and connected, Maria might be a mermaid who needs to submit her travel expenses in order to become a human. In a fictional disconnected perspective, Maria might be a mermaid who needs to report her travels and experiences to King Neptune. As you could see with each of these examples in a expense reporting learning scenario, we're getting farther and farther away from the the application that we're trying to train. So those may not be avenues or directions you want to go down to. With these additional examples, though, there will be instances where a different story perspective may be appropriate and have impact. And it's more likely that you'll use a variety of story perspectives when writing stories for gamification and experiences like alternate reality games. So thanks for your time and an opportunity to share a little bit about kind of the reasons that stories are impactful, some of the methods and techniques that can be used potentially, and then a little bit about stories and alternate reality games and the beginning of crafting stories. I'll turn it back over to Charles now, who's going to dive deeper into story crafting and some of the details around that.
Thank you, Andy. So, as Andy mentioned, we talked quite a bit about the science behind why humans gravitate towards stories. I want to dive into something, dive in a little deeper, and there are primarily two reasons why we're talking about stories today. One of those is on the entertainment side. We've seen a dramatic increase in the number of mainstream games which rely heavily on stories. The titles focus on this deep emotional connection rather than with the usual high kinetic experiences that we'll often see. Gamification in itself is learning, or as a process in learning, has become increasingly popular in recent years and expected to be an integral part of this year's online training efforts. Organizations are starting to see the value of developing successful gamification strategies, especially as a means of reaching reluctant or unmotivated employees and learners. So part of this shift that we're actually seeing is because stories are what we use to find connections. A game, whether it's analog or digital, can do that when it has a rich story associated with it. So, I pulled a quote that I thought was pretty good, and it was, here we're seeing truly great games stick with you because of memorable story elements that make you laugh, cry, or they mention it here, but really I think it's change your attitude. So if we think back to the neuromodulators that Andy described, these are some of the reasons why those connections happen. So for this portion of the presentation, as I mentioned, I want to dive a little deeper into the development process itself. And to do that, let's talk a little bit about stories. They've been around as long as we've been around. But instead of thinking about the purely spoken word, I wanted to take a couple minutes and compare sort of the prominent storytelling formats, namely books, movies, and games. So when you read a story, you're experiencing the world in third person. There's an author, and you're gleaning the depth of the content from the words that you're reading. In cinema, we see the story through second person. We observe the actions and gain additional nuances from hearing and seeing a scene played out in front of us. In games, however, the player is in the driver's seat. We discover and investigate from doing things in the scene, and actually when you add on interactivity, we provide the player the ability to experience the story firsthand. Players then have the opportunity to project their motivations and emotions into the world, and there's an expectation that the world will respond accordingly. If I turn a doorknob in a virtual game, I expect the door to open up, and there's that sort of affordance that we're transmitting from the real world into the game world. In this format, we often see that the information is revealed via discovery, and the player is guiding through the world rather than being guided by the lens of a cameraman, as we saw in the cinema examples. So where movies communicate depth and narration visually, we like to think of games, simulations, gamificated objects or activities. We actually glean information, or we gain depth through the experiential content. So that's a little comparison of the various methods, the delivery methods, but let's also look at the story structure itself. In its simplest form, whenever you've thought of a story, you've told a story, you've experienced a story, there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. Within these large groups of beginning, middle, and end, we saw actions and events that progressed the story forward. So this is a very common chart if you've done any short story writing, or actually writing at all. You'll see this is sort of a very common arc that we'll see, where the story starts off with some introduction of characters and maybe scenarios, or there could be some initial conflict that's taking place. And that drives into this idea of rising action, or a series of actions that take place where they increase in intensity until we get to some climatic event. And then there's a falling action, and that resolves in some, hopefully, in most stories, to some type of conclusion at the other end. That arc or that sort of structure that we've seen is so common. It's actually the most common structure that we see, and that beginning, middle, and end actually correlates to Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, where those acts are then broken up into subbeats of activities that have taken place. And here is just, at its root level, the bullet list there. It sort of breaks up some of the things that might happen in that type of structure. On the right, we see how that content or how that structure might play out with given some content in it. And there are a lot of things that you can go out and take a look at. Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, which sort of breaks down this structure into, depending on which version you look at, 12 or 17 different beats that take place in your story, and you can follow the story along, and you can actually see those beats in a variety of Hollywood-centric films, as well as books that we've seen throughout the ages as well. More recently, Blake Snyder, Save the Cats book. I don't know if you've actually heard of that book. If you could type it in the chat session, that would be great. But he actually approached it from storytelling. He approached movies from storytelling, but also as a more templatized event. So there's a template that screenwriters use to actually help tell their Hollywood stories, their big budget on-screen stories. And it really breaks it down into, on page 7, you should be talking about this in your story. Or you make sure that you've checked off these boxes and included those all. But we talk about this and we mention it because this idea that having a structure for a story is nothing new for us. But when we talk about ARGs, there is a slightly different approach that we see. In traditional stories, we often think about the characters first and then move into a setting, think about the challenges, and think of how it's going to end. In most ARGs or e-learning activities, it's the reverse. We're thinking about what is the outcome we're trying to anticipate, what behavior are we trying to elicit or change within the player. In order to show that player that outcome or master it, we set up a series of challenges. And then we might think about, well, where would those challenges take place? And that might help us identify a setting, or that might actually do character as well. Sometimes those two things come together. But the idea here is that in order to get to a story in an e-learning situation, we often think of it as reverse of what we see in general cinema and entertainment venues. So when you think about crafting a story, we might think about, where do I begin? What's the first step that I need to take in order to do it? Down the list here is actually a number of steps in the production of a gamified experience or an alternate reality game, where we initiate the project, we move into pre-production, there are a variety of steps that take place there. The production, post-production, we go live, and then hopefully we come back and we look at what happened and we assess or have a post-mortem about the event and figure out where we can improve it next time. As we talk about story here today, we're really talking about designing the experience itself. And as I've talked to a number of other people, there's this idea of brainstorming that takes place. We're all used to the term of brainstorming and what it means to start a game off or start a project off and getting a group of people together to brainstorm an idea. But it's not actually the solo person sitting at a keyboard, who has a light bulb event that pops up. There are actually a number of ways that we can actually have successful brainstorming sessions so that we get to our stories a little quicker and that they are a little richer. I'm not going to go through all these steps, but I do want to highlight a few of them. It's great to identify your goals. Decide who should be in the brainstorming session. You want decision makers, but you also want people who, I hate this term, but who think differently, think out of the box, or people who will bring new ideas to the table. Your environment should be comfortable, but when you get down to it and actually start your brainstorming, you want to have a warm-up session. Quite often you might start brainstorming something else, or you might start it with food, or you might start it with some other creative activity not directly related to brainstorming your idea, but just something to get the juices flowing. After your warm-up, everyone, if you give them the objectives of what you're trying to do, everyone is going to have that first idea. This is the point where we actually do a brain dump. We just get all of those ideas out there. There will be some good ideas. There will be some bad ideas. But in some of the exercises that Andy and I have done, we've sort of dumped all the ideas out there and then started grouping them together to find out which ones worked as a unit, which one were solely unique and may have ideas of moving further. That got us to when we started thinking really differently. And, and Andy's example of the mermaid, comes out of this sort of thing of thinking completely different from the activity that the employee is trying to gain and put them in control of a different player. They can play themselves, but they can also see the world differently from someone else's eyes. And then it's, this isn't a one-shot deal. We ideate on the idea. We just go again and again and again until we're sort of comfortable with the direction, whether that be setting character, challenges, those sort of things that we go through. But we keep rehearsing it and going it over again and again and again until we finalize onto an idea that works. Some of the other things to think about in that session, silence doesn't mean that someone is not engaged. And yes, there are bad ideas. There are some things that you'll cross off right away, but there are some things that you're not sure about, and they might go into your C column. A ideas, B ideas, C ideas. And for things to come back and revisit later on. Actually, one exercise I'll add here is, especially in my classroom with my students, I often force them to get one idea out, put it on a piece of paper, and put it aside. That's a safe idea, the first one that comes out normally. It's a very safe and probably a tried and true method, but use that as a backup, not as the primary source of going to. And then the last is knowing when you've sort of beaten that horse dead and knowing when, probably based on schedule, that you should move on to the next step. So there are a variety of tools out there that you can use. Upper left, we have a mind map, which is used for digitally, mostly digital purposes. It can be a collaborative tool where you start with a bunch of sort of branching ideas and see where they take you. But you can also go low-tech and just use Post-it notes. We've done this a number of times with just filling a board with Post-it notes. Post-it notes are great because they allow you to reorganize things very quickly. They allow for easy and quick editing. You can also take snapshots of them after the fact and sort of retain all that information. Probably the most important thing is getting a great group of people together that you are open to have ideas and can bounce things back and forth. GroupZap, yes, GroupZap is a great digital tool for doing it as well. There's also a tool that we found that sort of we use as a kickoff, and there is a website, there's an iPad and an iPhone version, or mobile versions as well, but it's called the Brainstormer. There is a URL at the end, there's a URL at the very end of the presentation that links out to it. And it's a great way of sort of just, spinning the dice and seeing what you get, combining the boring, unethical, I think gigolo is what that said, and sort of pick things from all columns, as one of the things Andrew mentioned before, pick things together and see what story you tell, or just take a task to try and build something from there. So early on, I talked a bit about traditional media versus ARG development, and when we think about that production process, in the early stages, these things are very similar. We get to a point where we come up with an idea and we start refining it. In the traditional media, we normally move off into production and with asset creation or shooting schedules or a variety of things. In ARG productions, we generally now move on into this evaluation of the participants. What activities do you need people to do, and what are the technologies or what are the items that you need in order to do that? Then we move into refinement. Then we actually do a treatment, which gives us the ability to test our assumptions about the process and about what we're creating. So there is a divergence from traditional media, and we'll go through these things. And I do want to discuss this first item that's listed up there, and that's participation, evaluating the participants. In a previous webinar, we discussed this idea of player participation broken up into three various levels. There is passive, active, and immersive. Passive participation is sort of watching videos. It might be reading a certain passage from, let's say, a sales manual, or going out into the world and collecting information through QR codes or RFID tags or something like that. The player's involvement is light, but it's very accessible, and they can do these activities in a variety of places. The next will be more active, and this is where we get engaged involvement in not just the story, but the game world itself. We'll see players go off and actively complete challenges, such as puzzles or challenge questions or doing some research, maybe even collaborating in small groups to come up with a solution for a challenge to progress the story along. If you remember the middle section of our chart previously that we looked at, the story arc, I should have put it here as well, but the middle part of that was a rising tension, and those were a number or a series of challenges that were presented to the viewer in a film or the player in an ARG. And creating those is what is the mechanism that we use to actually progress the story along. The last is one that we haven't built a lot of, but there are some great examples of the immersive participation. This is where the player does more than just engage with the content. The player is actually responsible for crafting or creating content for the world. In these examples of immersive games, the world does not progress without the players actually engaging and making content for the world. There's some great examples out there of various ways that this has been done. Library of the Future was a great one where the participants came and spent an evening in the library going through and finding artifacts and crafting stories around those artifacts to create a document that was then used at the very end of the process. So there are a lot of great examples out there for immersive learning. Difficult, time-consuming, but extremely rewarding for the end result. There's a term that's quite often used, and you may be familiar with it, but it's the rabbit hole. And the rabbit hole is a device that you'll use to hook the player into the game world itself. Remember, the player might not actually at first realize they're playing a game. Such as Robots Are Eating the Building, the players started the game in a lecture hall watching a video, and that was their introduction into the game itself. In another game we created for Petency, for an educational organization, the rabbit hole was various players finding tweets or finding messages left on a website. There are so many different ways. Imagine the poster that you see here, which is actually for an ARG in San Francisco, where there's a phone number on there and there's a website. And if you visit that, you sort of go down the rabbit hole of intrigue, finding a variety of things. There was a very famous one where participants at an event in San Diego, as they went through the conference that was taking place, some of them got dollar bills that had a red phone number and a smile, sort of a crooked smile printed on it. And if they dived in and read that phone number, it told them to go to a certain location. If they went outside, they saw an airplane fly across in the sky and write something in there. And eventually they got down to realizing that a prisoner had escaped from Arkham Asylum, and they were tasked with helping the police track down that player. And so, you know, the actual dollar bill had "Are You Serious?" on it, and that was the sort of introduction of the Dark Knight series of films. But the idea of the rabbit hole is it's trying to blur the lines between the real world and the fictional world. It's pretty obvious for your player a couple steps in that they're playing a game, but this level of curiosity and sort of having them be hyper-aware is very interesting to see in the very beginning. I'm going to finish up here with talking about sort of settings and characters. We're not going to talk a lot about characters, but as we think about settings, we want to think about location, 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 right? So as we present your rabbit hole, and your rabbit hole could be in an environment or it could lead to an environment, we use imagery and we use locations to help set the tone of the game. It gives the player an environment to play in, and it does set their expectations of what's going to happen next. If we could use the chat session, if you saw this image right here, what can you tell me that might be about the game world you're about to enter? Is there anything telling in this image that drives you to believe or understand something or create some preconceived notion about the world? So we see a couple people chatting there. A forest in Oz, the countryside, some dark and mysterious tunnel. Fairies could definitely live in this environment. The trees might be magical or have personalities of their own. There is a sense of impending doom as I go down this, as the branches and the arches are created over the road. What about this one? In this image, I have a different note for that one. If this were the environment, what type of characters do you expect to find there? What type of characters might ask questions of the players or drive the player through the game? So medieval, maybe it's a wizard shrine or some type of shrine. I did say impending doom. Uh, um, yeah, so using this idea of location in imagery, monks, uh, using these ideas can really help bring the player into the environment. I have one more of these. What about this one? What do you think might be the players? What do you think might be some of the challenges presented to them? So futuristic pops up really quickly. Star Wars, something high tech, very sterile environment. Robots, yep. So you can see how just placing in an image and using that to drive your story can immediately evoke a method or a feeling within your viewers that they are going to be thinking down a particular train of thought. When we get to thinking about characters, again, on the left-hand side, you see we sort of tick through each of these areas. But when we think about characters, when we create characters, we often think of a number of things. Who are the players in the game? Where did they come from? I'm sorry, not the players. Who are the characters? Where do they come from? How do they interact with the players themselves? Are they friends? Are they foes? Are they advisors? Are they just side characters that we can get information from? There's a whole list of different characteristics that we might pull out of our out of characters. And as I mentioned, we don't have enough time to go into stories, and I added a URL at the bottom here, but there's a long list of archetypes that we could look through for characters themselves to see which characters might fit within our game world. And we're at our last bullet, except there is one other area that we should consider. And again, in a previous webinar, we discussed this, and I thought I'd just share it here as well. But the players themselves may break up into different categories as well. There's a thing called the Bardo Quotient. You see an example here. On our website, we have a refined version of this coming for e-learning specifically, but this was to entertainment games. But the idea here was that there are various players, and those players have different personalities that dictate the type of play. Not only does it dictate the type of play, but it dictates the type of activities they're looking for out of play. So your achievers are looking for points. They're looking to gain levels. They're looking to show off their achievements throughout the game. Explorers want to go and find everything, uncover every rock. They want to find any hidden Easter eggs. They want to be able to brag about the things they found. The socializers are normally in the game because they want to share the experience with other people. Sometimes that means they're actually enjoying interacting with NPCs or non-player characters, but in the most points, they're looking to use the game as a tool to meet other players in-game, but also maybe connect with them out of game. The killers I consider quite a misnomer in the title, but these are individuals that really thrive on competition. They might prefer fighting real players over some scripted AI in the game. They also tend to be a lot more interested in affecting their environment. So if you're building a world with sort of an open sandbox where the player could build their own thing or destroy something in a virtual society, they'll be happy with doing those type of activities. But remember, these are all just guidelines, and we use these guidelines just to, sometimes we've polled our players on the game itself beforehand, find out where the majority of them sit, make sure we have activities for them, and then pepper out the activities for the other players as well. So we're running very low on time here. Andy, I'm going to take another 2 minutes here. But here's something really quick. What I'd like people to do in the chat session is identify an outcome, identify a challenge, identify a setting, and identify a character that might overcome. Part of the brainstorming that we've talked about and part of the brainstorming that we'll do on various occasions is just this idea of stringing these things together. I might say completing an expense report on time is the outcome that I want. The challenge is that the mermaid has to talk to Poseidon before they can actually submit. The setting would be the bottom of the ocean, and the character would be a mermaid that has been excommunicated from the cohort for some reason. And throwing all those things together, and sometimes you end up with a gem. Sometimes you use that gem to spark other ideas. But as a brainstorming activity, we found this to be something very rewarding and very satisfying in the development of our ARGs. So I, for the first time ever, got through all my slides. I'd like to hand it back to Andy, and we'll start with some questions and answers.
Thanks, Charles, and certainly continue the activity that Charles started as we kind of wrap up here. If you want to type in some ideas for your brainstorming session, but if not, as Charles mentioned, that's a good technique to take with you to kind of get started on beginning to build stories, which are certainly multifaceted. The dialogue itself is a very intricate part of it, but as Charles mentioned, there's a lot of planning and ideation that even comes before then. So certainly we can take some questions in the text chat, and we'll either type those answers in as we continue to wrap up here, or we'll answer those directly. Charles, Michelle has a question about ARG tools that are out there. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Twine and maybe Conductor.
Sure. So Conductor is a great tool. It's an end-to-end solution where in the tool itself you can build your story assets. You can also connect it to your social media channels, as well as incorporate cell phone, mobile phone, video, all into one engine, and then the engine itself doles out the information as your players interact with it. It's on the high end of engagement for the development team. On the low end is a tool called Twine, which is an interactive story tool which provides the ability to pretty much make hyperlinks so that as the players read or watch a passage, they're then presented with choices, and through those choices, I drive down sort of the rabbit hole again into a branching story narrative to get to some conclusions at the other end. I believe the next slide, or there's a slide there, which has the links to Twine, and I will put the Conductor link in the chat session right now.
Thanks, Charles. And alternate reality games by their nature are transmedia as well. And Charles mentioned, Conductor does a good job of pulling a lot of those things together, but really ARGs tend to be a mismatch or a mishmatch of a bunch of different technologies, all mashed up together to really create the experience and the technology infrastructure for that particular ARG. So here's some more information about the book, and Charles did a great job of kind of describing what's available out there now. The website will be launched. The book is available and can be bought on Amazon. And we talk about storytelling as a component of alternate reality games, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to storytelling and kind of crafting the story of the ARG. And finally, we have another upcoming webinar for those of you that have been participating in the series. This is kind of the second in the series. You can see recording of the first one on the TrainingPros website if you didn't get to that. And then the final one in the series is kind of jumping off from where we are today and talking about participation, which is highly connected with story, both in e-learning and alternate reality games. So that's our time for today, and thank you guys for your participation and activity in the chat. And I'm going to hand it back over to Justin to wrap things up, including an opportunity for some feedback if you can stick around for a few moments and give us your thoughts on today's session. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Andy and Charles. That was awesome. I know I learned a lot, and hopefully everyone else did as well. So Andy talked a little bit about the book and some upcoming webinars that we're having. We're Harrisburg University of Science and Technology. We offer a Learning Technologies Master of Science program, so be sure to check us out there. We are very grateful for David of TrainingPros, and the partnership that we have with TrainingPros is very valuable to us. It allows us to produce webinars like this, so we're very grateful for that partnership. So thank you all very much. I know the time's up. I'm going to shift over to a feedback slide. Please do give us some feedback so we can continue to improve these, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.